Give thanks, my people. That is ram goat liver. That is ram goat liver by Pluto Shevington. Give thanks for tuning in to Creole Talk, my people. As we say, we're going to be talking tonight to Luciano Barraco, talking about the Sampits Rebellion. All right. Remember, I said that the last time we had this brother on here who was talking about Chief Robert Henry Clarence, the last hereditary chief of the Moskitia Reserve. Okay. The Moskitia Reservation. And that's what we stay on. That next time we come on to the program, we're going to be talking about the rebellion, because it's a part of our history where we're not really and truly, well, no part of Moskitian history was ever taught to us in school. And so that's why we find the need to talk to these historians, them, to talk to these people them who study the material, you know, and sometimes on their own accord, you know. You must know that, you know, which is a book that everybody should have this book inside of their library. You understand me? The Indigenous Struggles for Autonomy. This is a book where you have to have in your library. You know, this is written by our brethren right here, Luciano Barraco. So, good morning, brother. How are you doing? How is everything going with you?
Good morning, Ariel. Nice to speak to you again.
Most definitely, brother. Most definitely. Give thanks, man. Remind us again where it is where you is right now.
Well, I live in the north of England, in the city of York, the old city of York in England. It's 5 o'clock in the morning here, but I'm very pleased to be able to speak to you nonetheless.
Give thanks, brother. Give thanks. We truly appreciate it, man. We definitely appreciate it. I hear like an echo there. Is there something going on there? Like,
I'm afraid it. Mm-hmm. Can you hear me properly? Or?
Yeah, I could hear you good.
All right.
Yeah. All right. Good then. Definitely. So I could get right into it, brother. So like we was discussing the last time, we was hearing him, and we was talking about, you know, Chief Robert Henry, and that's what we stayed on, is that we was reaching towards the Sampits Rebellion, and so we want to dive directly into that. But before we get into that, I just want you remind us again, you know, why is it that you find that this information, despite the history not being written in, you know, in benefit of the Moskitian people, of the indigenous people from Moskitia, why is it that you find it so important to bring this information to light?
Right. Well, as I said in the previous interview, that I began my studies on Nicaragua with an interest in the Sandinista Revolution in 1979. And I spent time in Nicaragua to do my PhD research. And towards the end of that research, I began to study the autonomy process and the history of the Caribbean coast, or the Moskitia. And after my graduation from my PhD, my postdoctoral studies focused on the multi-ethnic, pluricultural Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, or the Moskitia. And I found that this was a history that was yet to be written. It was entirely new to me. And the other issue was that I came across some historical documents, not many, but a handful of historical documents, and there were diplomatic correspondence. And within them, there was lots of correspondence from Nicaraguan politicians and British diplomats and US diplomats. But there were also original letters and petitions written by Miskitu leaders. And these had never been published. And within these documents was a whole history of the Mosquito, but by the Mosquito as well, written by the Mosquito. Okay, not written by sociologists and historians like me, not written by British politicians, but written by Mosquito leaders. And it gave these documents, if they were published and researched, they gave the Mosquito a historical voice, which was missing from all the academic literature. And that's, I thought it was a really important gap, an absence that should be corrected. So that's how I became fascinated with the Moskitia because of the autonomy process, looking at it, looking at the design of it, looking at its aims and objectives, particularly in relation to trying to resolve a conflict that had been inflicting the regions throughout the 1980s. And I also became interested in how it was being undermined as well by national politicians, by Nicaraguan politicians based in Managua. And I have led a number of research teams which have included costeños to look at the many dimensions of the autonomy process. But the discovery of these historical documents, these diplomatic correspondence, changed my focus from the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. It changed that focus to the 19th century and the creation of the ending of the Kingdom of Moskitia, the creation of the Mosquito Reservation and its incorporation, and the Mosquito resistance to that incorporation. So at the moment, what I'm trying to do is disclose that unwritten, unheard of history of Mosquito resistance towards that incorporation.
And
Does that answer your question, Ariel?
definitely. And so the Sampits rebellion turned out to be the very first resistance in this then.
Well, actually, not the very first resistance, because this is the interesting point, because actually there was resistance at the very point of the incorporation itself. Now, so what I'd like to do with this interview is to actually go through some of the details of the incorporation itself, and then out of which the Sam Pitts rebellion grew. Okay, now in order to do this accurately, I've got my lots of notes in front of me, so it might take me. There might be slight pauses whilst I sift through these notes, because I want to quote some of the actual diplomatic correspondence from the 1890s, written by Chief Robert Henry Clarence as well. Okay, so the first part will be a short resume of what happened when the Nicaraguans arrived to take over the reservation. Was that okay with you?
Most definitely, brother. Go right ahead.
Okay, so just a short recap of the diplomatic history is that there was an increasing competition between Britain and the United States over the Central American region because it was a potential site for an interoceanic canal. And in fact, the British and the Americans could have gone to war over this. So they signed a treaty called the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty in 1850, which prohibited the colonization and military expeditions on the Central American Isthmus by Britain and the United States. But Britain had a protectorate over the Mosquito coast, the Mosquito region, and the Americans didn't like this at all, because it felt that they felt that the British had an advantage over them, and any potential interoceanic canal could be controlled by the British because they'd got this protectorate. After a lot of diplomatic wrangling, which maybe could be the subject of another interview, but after a lot of diplomatic wrangling, the British signed a series of treaties with Central American governments. They signed a treaty with Honduras, which gave up the Bay Islands, which was a colony, British colony. The Treaty of Comayagua in 1859, and handed over to the Republic of Honduras the part of the Mosquito Kingdom that had existed on territory which was now considered the territory of the Republic of Honduras. Now, on the territory which was now considered the Republic of Nicaragua, they signed a treaty that handed over significant parts of what had been the Kingdom of Moskitia, including San Juan del Norte, or Grey Towns, up to the Rio Rama, and parts of northern, round the Cabo Gracias a Dios, and around the Rio Coco, the Rio Wanqui River. And they created a reservation, what's called a mosquito reservation. And it was a significant strip of land, but very much diminished, very much smaller from the Kingdom of Moskitia. And Article 3 of the Treaty of Managua, which was signed in 1860, said that the Mosquito Indians would have a defined piece of land which they could govern according to their own laws and their own history and their own traditions and their own conventions. And so they were autonomous. They were granted autonomy by this treaty. There was lots of, Nicaragua didn't like it, but it was kind of forced into it by the British. There was constant bickering, constant arguments over what was the rights, what was the power of the sovereign nation of Nicaragua, and what were the rights of the autonomous Mosquito government. And one of them was about taxation. For example, Nicaragua wanted the Mosquito reservation was developing a really lucrative economy. It exported timber, it exported rubber. There was also gold discovered there, excuse me, and there was banana plantations as well. So it was a thriving economy, and Nicaragua wanted to tax the exports from this autonomous reservation. They began to put pressure on the Mosquito Council. The Mosquito Council appealed to the British, and there was an agreement between Nicaragua and Britain to submit complaints to the Emperor of Austria for international arbitration. In 1881, the arbitration reported that Nicaragua did not have the right to intervene in the Mosquito reservation politically or economically. That the reservation council had the right to tax imports and exports and use the money revenues raised from that for the well-being of the Mosquito reservation. Now, with the discovery of gold in the 1880s, I think that Nicaragua really decided that it must get its hands on the reservation and stop this, incorporate the reservation. So there were various complaints, there were various diplomatic initiatives, but the British were actually, in some senses, they were supportive. They said that it would be better if this area was incorporated into the Republic of Nicaragua as long as the Indians were protected. However, they also said and insisted that any incorporation would have to be voluntary. And this was, in fact, there was a clause in the Treaty of Managua to say that the incorporation could not be forced, it could not be pressured, it had to be voluntary. And as long as the British insisted on this, the Nicaraguans were stuck. They couldn't get what they wanted. However, things changed in the 1890s. In 1893, end of 1893, and the beginning of 1894, there was a conflict between Nicaragua and Honduras. Nicaraguan troops went down the Rio San Juan via San Juan del Norte, or grey towns. They went to Bluefields. They stopped in Bluefields overnight, and they went to northern Nicaragua, and they had a battle with Honduran troops. They beat the Honduran troops back, and they came back to Bluefields on their way back to grey towns and into the interior of Nicaragua via the Rio San Juan. Now, when the troops arrived in Bluefields, Robert Henry Clarence, the hereditary chief and the president of the Council of Moskitia, complained to the military head of the troops, General Rigoberto Cabezas, and the Nicaraguan commissioner, who was Carlos Lacayo, because they didn't have a right to station troops in anywhere in the reservation without permission from the Mosquito Council. Now, this was cynically exploited, in fact, by particularly Rigoberto Cabezas. And he claimed that these complaints by Chief Clarence was actually sympathy for Honduras, and it clearly wasn't. Chief Clarence had already sent a letter to the British consul saying that he was concerned about the security of the Moskitia because of there could be an invasion from Honduras, and he'd asked the British to send a warship to protect the Moskitia. So there was no way he had any kind of sympathies whatsoever with the Hondurans. He was actually quite concerned, so concerned that he'd asked for British protection. However, the complaints were twisted and manipulated. Rigoberto Cabezas said they were traitorous, complaints that tried to stop Nicaragua from defending itself. And in February, let's see, I just need to consult my notes. In February 1894, Nicaraguan troops landed in Bluefields and took over the public buildings. They took over the prison and opened the prison and released the prisoners, and denounced and overthrew the Mosquito Council. And with that, Chief Robert Henry Clarence sent a protest to the British consul Herbert Bingham to inform the British that what the Nicaraguans had done. And I've got his dispatch right in front of me now. It says, the Chief of Mosquito Indians to Consul Bingham, Bluefields, February the 12th, 1894. I have thought it prudent to send this dispatch to you to inform you that about midnight, the Nicaraguan troops under the command of Commissioner entered and took forcible possession of the public buildings of the government, letting loose the prisoners upon the public. Very much excitement is caused by these proceedings. The arms of the municipal government have been taken away by them, and the hoisting of the Nicaraguan flag on the staff of the Mosquito government. The people, being very excited, have congregated in bodies about the streets, and the soldiers are driving them off at the point of the bayonet. And these rash and unprecedented proceedings may cause bloodshed and murder. I therefore protest against these acts and call upon Her Britannic Majesty's government for immediate redress in the high-handed proceedings, and I do therefore solemnly protest accordingly. Signed, Robert Henry Clarence, Chief and President of the Mosquito Council. So here we have the first news arriving of Nicaragua's invasion, sent by Robert Henry Clarence to the British. Now, soon afterwards, a British warship, HMS Cleopatra, arrived in Bluefields. This warship was there to protect British lives and property, but was also to try to figure out what was going on. Remember that this is the age before electronic communication. Okay, so there was a telegraph at Greytowns or San Juan del Norte, but it was often broken. And so the nearest reliable telegraph was in Puerto Limon in Costa Rica. Now this means that information is often delayed. So what happened is there was a discussion between the captain of the HMS Cleopatra. The captain was called Captain Assheton Curzon Howe, and he arrived with Consul Bingham on board on the February 25th, 1894 at Bluefields, and he had an immediate meeting with the Commissioner Lacayo and Rigoberto Cabezas, and they decided that that they'd taken over the town, and it was a good idea to send Nicaraguan troops away, otherwise there could be bloodshed. There was talk of an Indian rebellion. Indians were arming themselves, not in Bluefields, because there were very few Indians lived in Bluefields at the time, but in Pearl Lagoon. And there's a report that I've read that there was 100 armed Indians ready to sail to Pearl Lagoon and take on the Nicaraguan soldiers. So yes, the Sandpits Rebellion was an armed rebellion, but actually the potential for rebellion existed right from the beginning. And in fact, it was the British naval officer who persuaded the Indians and the Creoles and the American business community in Bluefields not to resist. The American business community was very angry with the Nicaraguans because they had invested in Bluefields and the Mosquito Reservation on the condition that there was low taxes and low import duties. And they knew that if the Nicaraguans arrived and took over, those taxes and import duties would increase. And so it wasn't, this military operation by Nicaragua wasn't just resisted by Indians. It was also resisted by Creoles and the expat, the business community as well. Captain Curzon Howe persuaded Commissioner Lacayo to evacuate most of the Nicaraguan troops to Greytowns, where they would take a ferry to San Carlos and back to Managua. It was quite obvious that these accusations that Chief Clarence had sided with President Vasquez of Honduras were false. By the time, for example, by the time that Nicaraguan troops landed in Bluefields, President Vázquez of Honduras had been defeated. The war was over. And also, we also know that Commissioner Lacayo, a few months earlier, had offered Chief Clarence the position, the lifelong position of Brigadier General in the Nicaraguan army, and a lifelong stipend or a lifelong salary if he agreed to incorporate the reservation into Nicaragua. And to which the chief replied, and I quote the chief, "We have no power to give that away which does not belong to us." In other words, he refused point blank. With that refusal, I think that Commissioner Lacayo and General Cabezas had decided on a military operation to occupy Bluefields. So that the captain of the HMS Cleopatra persuaded Lacayo and Cabezas to send most of their troops away. Otherwise, there could be bloodshed. The idea would be to form a provisional government and let the diplomats, let the Nicaraguan government and the British government sort the situation out diplomatically rather than through violence. However, there were lots of attempts to form a provisional government, but none of them worked. You know, the Moskitia Council disagreed, the Nicaraguans disagreed, and the US business community also disagreed. It's very, the chief had a meeting with Captain Curzon Howe on February the 26th to discuss the situation. And just to briefly quote from Curzon Howe's report, Curzon Howe wasn't particularly impressed with Chief Robert Henry Clarence. He actually writes disparagingly about him. He described him as a young Indian of about 21 years of age, very ignorant and with very little will of his own. He believed that he was under the control of the Creole councillors that advised him, who were on the Moskitia Council. Excuse me. Nonetheless, efforts continued to negotiate for a provisional council. These were basically going nowhere. They were failures. And what happened then was the Captain Curzon Howe asked Chief Clarence if he would be willing to form a provisional council until the British government and the Nicaraguan government sorted things out. And the Robert Henry Clarence said no. And he said no because in the absence of a British warship, he would have been murdered. He would have been killed. And he said that, and so would the other councillors, the Creole council, predominantly Creole councillors, would have been killed as well. And so Bluefields was in limbo. It had no governing, structures whatsoever. The Moskitia Council had been overthrown. A provisional council had yet to be formed. No one could agree about anything. It was a chaotic situation. And when the British, under the guidance of the naval officer Curzon Howe, asked the Moskitia Council to reform, this effort failed as well. So it kind of, de facto, it left Commissioner Lacayo and Rigoberto Cabezas in charge by the very fact that they had occupied Government House and had some soldiers around them to protect them. Now, if you can just bear with me and read some notes. Now, this situation was, of course, quite dangerous for law and order. And also there was an incident where Chief Clarence was walking down the street in Bluefields, and he went into a shop and was followed by what he calls a Spaniard or a Nicaraguan, who tried to stab him and kill him. And he was saved by passers-by who apprehended the person who was trying to kill him and disarmed him. Chief Clarence was then taken into protective custody, or under the protection of Curzon Howe, and sent to the Bluff, where there was where the main body of British naval forces were stationed. So what happened is Rigoberto Cabezas and Commissioner Lacayo agreed to send the troops away back to San Juan del Norte, or Greytowns, and they would have to be transported by HMS Cleopatra. And Captain Curzon Howe agreed to leave about 60 British Marines and naval sailors on the Bluff, and they could be called upon by Lacayo if there was a disturbance or there was a need to protect life and property. So whilst Curzon Howe was sailing towards Greytown with these couple of hundred Nicaraguan soldiers, there were disturbances began. As I said, that there had been an attempt on Robert Henry Clarence's life, and on March the 6th, it was reported that a servant of Lacayo had gone running down the main street of Bluefields, firing a revolver randomly. Now, actually, I've read reports of this in the Bluefields Messenger, the newspaper of Bluefields, and it turns out that this person was actually a Creole. He wasn't Nicaraguan, he was Creole, and he was shouting abuse at other Creoles and firing his gun. Unfortunately, nobody was killed, and he was disarmed. Now, the police force there was a small force of Nicaraguan soldiers left behind. Now, these would act as a police force, but they were quite aggressive towards the local population. So later, on the same day as that this person had gone round firing his revolver randomly, Nicaraguan soldiers mounted patrols around the main part of the town, and they confiscated things from local people. Certainly they confiscated guns, but the British had already confiscated lots of guns as well. But they began to confiscate things like billiard cues and canes that could be used as sticks to beat people with. And they entered a billiard hall and became aggressive with people. And in fact, a fight broke out in which one Nicaraguan soldier was killed. And soon afterwards, the British and the American vice consuls came downtown to see what was happening, and they met Commissioner Lacayo with around 60 armed men who were shouting racist abuse at Creoles. And they were going to the billiard hall where the Nicaraguan soldiers had been killed. You can imagine that there could have been a massacre. So the British and American vice consuls persuaded Commissioner Lacayo to send a request to somebody called Lieutenant Colmore of the HMS Cleopatra, who had been left behind on the bluff. They persuaded him to send a request to land his men to maintain order. Now, Lacayo agreed to this, but verbally he didn't write anything down. Herbert Bingham, the British vice consul, sent a written request to Lieutenant Colmore, and British troops landed in the morning of March the 6th, and they marched with bayonets fixed around the town. And just to quote Lieutenant Colmore, he said, "The effect was magical. The crowd, on hearing of our arrival, almost vanished, with the exception of a few people who remained behind out of curiosity." Okay, so the chief was brought with them. He'd sought sanctuary on the bluff. They brought the chief with him, and it was then placed under the protection of Consul Bingham at the British consul in Bluefields, and he lodged with him. Lieutenant Colmore then sent out marine patrols, and they discovered 500 rifles and ammunition and so on, which was then confiscated and taken on board their boats and sent to the bluff. Now, if you just give me a minute, the potential for violence was avoided, at least for now. An uneasy calm presided over Bluefields, as I said, that British and Nicaraguan governments began to negotiate some kind of agreement. What was going to happen? Were they going to keep the Treaty of Managua, or were they going to get rid of it? Were they going to allow Nicaragua to get away with what was clearly a breach of their international treaty obligations? So an uneasy peace existed in Bluefields, but it was broken on July the 5th. Now, many of your listeners may know that there was a kind of rebellion, and it was led by Creole police officers. It was soon crushed, and Nicaraguan forces landed. But what I've done, from what I can tell your listeners now, is that I've reviewed the diplomatic correspondence and the newspaper articles, and I can now give you a kind of detail of what actually happened. So on July the 5th, a disturbance took place at Government House in Bluefield, when around about 10 police officers, they were all Creoles, they arrived at Government House and they're demanding wages. They hadn't been paid for something like a month or 6 weeks. They were kept waiting. They were then threatened, and they were thrown out of the building. But they returned, and then they were called into an office by Rigoberto Cabezas. And at the time, Rigoberto Cabezas he was the new commissioner. Antonio Lacayo had gone, and he'd been replaced by General Cabezas. He was the commissioner who was in charge of everything for Nicaragua. The police officers were invited into an office, and there they were confronted by armed troops. The policemen resisted, and some of them were injured by swords and bayonets. And from the accounts that I read, the magistrate was an American businessman, turned up. He was also the chief of police. He calmed the situation down. He persuaded Cabezas to pay the overdue wages. Two police officers were arrested. Both of them had been wounded in the scuffle with bayonet. They'd got bayonet wounds. The other police officers were paid and they were released. Cabezas said he didn't want any more Jamaicans to be police officers. The police officers themselves, once they'd secured their wages, they were all resigned, and Bluefields was without a police force. Now, news of the incident spread across Bluefields, and many people were very angry and felt very threatened by what had happened. People began to gather outside a government house, and by 10 o'clock in the evening, shooting began, armed exchanges began, and it lasted until 4 o'clock in the morning. Now, sometime during the night, when this battle was raging in Bluefields, a small party of Creoles departed in a small boat from Bluefields to heading for the bluff. And there were, at the bluff, there was a small group of Nicaraguans who were guarding ammunitions, and they also were guarding a Krupp field gun. Now, given that the majority of buildings in Bluefields were made of wood, were wooden, a field gun like that could have destroyed the whole town. Now, when the Creoles landed, there was a firefight. 2 Nicaraguans were killed, there's some wounded, and the rest were taken prisoner or hostage. The arms, including the field gun, were loaded up on boats, and they were taken by the Creoles back to Bluefields. And from what I understand, the field gun was taken and pointed at the government house. Now, the general view was amongst Bluefieldeños, the residents of Bluefields, suggests that if the field gun hadn't been taken, Cabezas had given orders for it to be used to destroy the town. There was a US naval ship in the bay, USS Marblehead, under the command of Charles O'Neill, Captain Charles O'Neill. But the water, the channel between the bluff and Bluefields was too rough, and he couldn't make it in the night time. So for the time being, there was no authority. With the field gun pointed at the government house in which Cabezas was resident, and his family were resident as well, he basically surrendered. And there was no authority again, so the local people turned to Chief Clarence to resume his position and to try and restore order. Chief Clarence accepted the request, and I can quote he issued a proclamation that was printed and distributed around Bluefields, and it said, "I, Robert Henry Clarence, hereditary chief of Moskitia, hereby proclaim that I have resumed my rightful authority as chief of Moskitia, and I call upon all law-abiding and loyal subjects to obey my authority and that of my office." And so, in the next few days, the Moskitia Council was reappointed, and it was an extremely embarrassing defeat for the Nicaraguans. So Sam Pitts certainly created a lot of resistance, but the resistance didn't begin with Sam Pitts. It began immediately with the arrival of Nicaraguan troops in July 1894. There were, the Moskitia Council was reinstated and began to run things. Now, Commissioner Cabezas agreed to surrender on condition that his safety and the safety of his troops were guaranteed, that the Nicaraguan prisoners taken at the bluff were released and joined them, and that all the weapons captured at the bluff, including the field gun, were handed over to Captain O'Neill of the USS Marblehead. Now, the chief and the Moskitia Council agreed to this. And when this was agreed, the Commissioner Cabezas, and all the Nicaraguans boarded a steamer called the Hendy, and they made their way back up the Rio Escondido to Rama. And in fact, they were so broken, they were so defeated that they didn't even have the money to pay for the ferry, and the Moskitia Council donated the money to pay for their passage up to Rama. It was a total defeat, an embarrassment for the whole of Nicaragua. Now, Cabezas was fuming. He said he will be back and get his revenge, but it wasn't as simple as that, because the episode in Bluefields had stirred up resistance to President Zelaya. President Zelaya had many enemies, political enemies, and what had happened in Bluefields emboldened them. It made them think, well, this is our chance. There was a threat of internal rebellions against the Nicaraguan government, against President Zelaya. And there were rumors of plots of rebellions against the central government, so that the troops that could have arrived at Bluefields to put down the Moskitia rebellion weren't available. They had to remain in Managua to protect the president and the interior of Nicaragua. Also, Cabezas stayed in, retreated to Rama, and he couldn't muster enough troops to go back to Bluefields and mount a counter assault because of the political instability. The political instability was then added to because the Vice President Ortiz, General Ortiz, who was a hero of the recent Nicaraguan-Honduran war, he resigned from his office, and people felt that he was going to be the one who led the rebellion. Now, General Ortiz was actually careful not to incite his supporters to rebel against Zelaya, but he was surprisingly, this really was a surprise to me, he was very critical. This is the Vice President of Nicaragua during the occupation of Bluefields. He was exceedingly critical of Zelaya. He was critical of Rigoberto Cabezas for sending troops to Bluefields. He estimated that the whole operation was costing about $100,000 US dollars, and Nicaragua was already virtually bankrupt. And so he was highly critical of the operation. And it was also at the point where July, it was the rainy season. At that time, the only way to approach Bluefields was by sea. And if the Moskitia Council got together an armed force, actually Bluefields was very easy to defend from a seaborne assault. They could even have sent riverboats up the Escondido River and intercepted any troops coming from Rigoberto Cabezas. So the situation from Nicaragua was actually quite not good at all. You know, for a brief time, the Moskitia had the upper hand. The rebellions against Zelaya did not take place, and eventually, very significant Nicaraguan forces were organized. About 400 of them went down through the Rio San Juan, via grey towns, and arrived on the bluff. And Commissioner Cabezas also managed to muster about 200 troops and sent them down the Escondido River to the bluff, where they rendezvoused with the other Nicaraguan forces. So you had a force of between 400 and 600 troops, And in this instance, the Mosquito Council didn't really have a chance of military success. Now, it also happens at the same time that HMS Mohawk arrived, a British Royal Naval vessel. And their orders were to protect British lives and property. Now, this is where the situation gets a little confusing. So the Nicaraguan troops arrived from Grey Towns on an American flagged steamer called the Ulu. Now, if we remember, there was a U.S. naval captain there called Captain O'Neill, and he had prohibited American boats from carrying any kind of military cargo at all, including troops, from Nicaraguan side or from the Mosquito side. And yet what happened is the Nicaraguan troops, when they arrived in Grey Towns, they were under the command of somebody called General Jose Madrid, who was the minister, who was actually the commissioner, who was the new commissioner of the Atlantic coast. He was also the Secretary of State for War for the Nicaraguan government. He illegally commandeered the American flagged steamer, the Ulu, and used it to transport Nicaraguan troops to the Bluff. At which point he got into not a fight, but a very heated argument with Captain O'Neill. They had no right to use, because they had no right to use North American US ships to transport military personnel. The Ulu rendezvoused with Cabezas at the Bluff, and Nicaraguan soldiers, about 400 Nicaraguan soldiers, landed in Bluefields on August the 3rd, 1894, and occupied the town. And in this instance, with such a large armed force of Nicaraguan soldiers, the Mosquito had no chance of resisting. Now, the Commander Stewart of the HMS Mohawk went to see Cabezas and warned him that the British Empire would deal with anybody who was breaking treaties with the British government. However, there was something else that I didn't say about the Treaty of Managua, is that although there was a Mosquito reservation which was autonomous, nonetheless the reservation was under Nicaraguan sovereignty. And so this meant that Commander Stewart was in a difficult situation. Commander Stewart had to obviously obey by international law, but he was not an international lawyer. He was a Royal Naval officer. He didn't understand he wasn't sure about international law. Now, if the reservation was autonomous but was under Nicaraguan sovereignty, and Britain and Nicaragua was not at war with each other, then Commander Stewart had no right to land any military personnel, except for without Nicaraguan permission. If he did so, it would have been against international law. So he negotiated his withdrawal from Bluefields. He couldn't. The town was peaceful as well. There was no resistance. British subjects who feared for their lives were offered asylum on the Mohawk, who would take them to Puerto Limon in Costa Rica. And by August the 8th, 100 British refugees boarded the Mohawk, and also among them was Robert Henry Clarence and HMS Mohawk, under the command of Commander Stewart, took Robert Henry Clarence into exile. They sailed away that night, and he never returned to the Moskitia. So that was the. I hope that's given a detailed description of the actual takeover of Bluefields. You know, what I'm really interested in, not the big history, you know, not international law and international events. I'm looking at the micro actions of people actually on the ground and what people did. This is what makes history come alive for me. And this is what makes people like Robert Henry Clarence become a realistic person, a real historical figure. And it kind of discloses at the glimpses of his personality. He, on August the 9th, he landed in Puerto Limon in Costa Rica. And then August the 12th, Chief Clarence said he wanted to he went to Jamaica, and he landed in Jamaica in Port Royal in Jamaica. And the British seemed a bit surprised that he was coming. There was no official delegation to meet him or anything like that. But he was given accommodation in the Raetown district of Kingston, and he was given a stipend by the Colonial Office to survive on until things had been sorted out between the Nicaraguan government and the British government. Now, Nicaragua was basically in control of the Mosquito Reservation, but it had to legalize this control. You know, it was a kind of a rogue operation, and Nicaragua's incorporation of the Mosquito Council certainly brought an end to the highly contested process. In 1889, Britain had welcomed some kind of suggestion by Nicaragua to negotiate some kind of incorporation, as long as the indigenous people agreed to it voluntarily, as stipulated by Article 4 of the Treaty of Managua. And clearly the Nicaraguans had broken this clause. In November 1894, once the chief had gone and the Mosquito Council had been exiled, a Mosquito Convention took place with about 100 Mosquito headmen present. Now, it was witnessed by North American residents of the town, and Rigoberto Cabezas was there. The Indians signed a decree of incorporation and transformed the Mosquito Reservation into the Department of Zelaya. The decree did give special rights to the indigenous people, including exemption from military service during times of peace and war, and exemption from taxation. And they also agreed that all revenues produced in the Mosquito Show would actually be used for the benefit of the local area. And 3 days later, 3 days after this, Andrew Hendy, Chief Clarence's cousin, was installed as the new hereditary chief, but he was appointed by Cabezas, right? He wasn't elected chief. Now, the diplomatic correspondence that I've read, especially by Consul Bingham, the British consul, and a newly arrived British consul called Herbert Harrison, they immediately questioned the voluntary nature of the Indians' consent for this incorporation. Now, um, the new vice consul Herbert Harrison was a professional diplomat, and he was much more observant than the previous consuls, who were local business people, British citizens who owned businesses. So Harrison was a professional diplomat, and he was much more observant about what was going on. And he reports that the Mosquito Convention was basically full of, you know, political skullduggery, especially by Cabezas, to secure the consent of the Indians, or the indigenous people. Harrison wrote a dispatch in 1895 to the Foreign Secretary of Britain, and he recounts his extensive discussions with the indigenous headmen, or the indigenous participants of the Mosquito Convention, and he said that only 12 delegates were actually recognized headmen from the reservation. Right, the rest, although there were 82 delegates, many of them were from Indian villages that were outside the reservation, and another 46 of them were young boys who could not have been. It wasn't possible for them to have been headmen. Now, of the delegates he spoke to, none of them had said that they'd discussed or agreed the incorporation. They didn't even discuss it. And he learned that most of the delegates couldn't actually speak Spanish or English, and many of them, or most of them, were actually illiterate. They'd also been plied with drink. So the whole thing, the whole scenario made it highly unlikely that they were capable of giving their informed consent to the incorporation. Now, given his many encounters with the Indians, there was no doubt that claims that Cabezas and the Nicaragua that they tricked the delegates into signing some kind of piece of paper that of incorporation. Right? Many of the people who signed it were not entitled to sign it. As I said, they weren't headmen; they were young boys. And Harrison signs off his dispatch by saying there can really be no question whether or not the Indians of the reservation do or not desire incorporation. From all I have seen, and from everyone who has been among them, without one exception, I hear that they do not. They do not want, or they do not want, or desire incorporation. Nonetheless, the British government accepted the decree of incorporation. Whatever the misgivings that British officials had about the incorporation, Britain just didn't have the political will to intervene on the behalf of the Mosquito Indians. And so over the next 10 to 13 years, countless diplomatic initiatives to sort this out properly were exchanged. And Chief Clarence was in exile in Jamaica. He set up his own diplomatic mission to oppose the incorporation and to restore the Mosquito Reservation. There were delegates, Mosquito delegates arrived to join him in 1900, and the Mosquito delegates included Sam Pitts. And they even had two delegations visited London in 1907. Both of them included Sam Pitts as well. If you could just bear with me, excuse me, I'm getting a hoarse voice here. So the delegates, the Mosquito delegates arrived let's see, they arrived in August 1900. Now, why did they arrive then? What was it? So in 1898 and 1899, President Zelaya began to increase taxes, and it caused a rebellion in Bluefields. And in fact, the leader of the rebellion wasn't the Indians; it was the Nicaraguan governor, who was he was actually an ally of Zelaya, and he was joined by the Creoles. He was joined by the American business community as well, who didn't want to pay tax. He was joined by Indians or indigenous people. And what happened is the rebellion was crushed, and I can't remember the governor's name. I can't remember the Nicaraguan governor's name. He sought refuge in Costa Rica, and the Nicaraguan government imposed the taxes. They also began to close Moravian schools as well because they taught in English, and the education instruction in English was banned, prohibited, and it had to be in Spanish. So that's how they closed the Moravian schools. Now, because of this, the Moskitia decided to send 3 delegates clandestinely to consult with Chief Clarence. They arrived in August 1900. They spoke with Chief Clarence, and he sent a letter to the British governor of Jamaica, who was called Sidney Olivier. And he introduced them, and they had their first meeting with Governor Olivier on August the 27th. And to read directly from Governor Olivier's dispatch to he sent a description of the meeting to the British Secretary for the Colonies, Austin Chamberlain. And just to read directly, these delegates reported themselves as George Cuthbert, a carpenter and interpreter, apparently a Jamaican Indian half-breed. Louis Nelson, and Louis Nelson, actually, his name wasn't Louis Nelson, it was Lino Nelson. Okay, so Louis Nelson and Samuel Pitts, Mosquito Indians described as laborers. Nelson seemed a respectable, capable man, speaking some English. Pitts spoke no English, but took a leading part in the conversation. He appeared to me to be a man of decided character, quiet, sensible, and appreciative of inquiry. So here Sam Pitts is introduced into history, okay? This is the first mention of Sam Pitts in the diplomatic mission. Oh, by the way, it's interesting to note that Sam Pitts was one of the delegates to the Mosquito Convention as well. So but I don't have any information about why he agreed to it, other than Consul Harris saying that they were forced into it and so on. Sam Pitts was illiterate, and it was clear that he was illiterate because for the many petitions that they sent to the British government, he signed his name X, indicating that he was illiterate. And there was actually somebody else, a Moravian missionary based in Kingston, who actually signed underneath it saying, "I witnessed Sam Pitts sign X." Okay, so they knew it was his. Now, Governor Olivier explains that the delegates had a number of complaints. They said that were oppressed by taxation, their lands were taken away from them. The Indians' land was then sold to American business and British business. They were deprived of their livelihood, so they couldn't tap rubber, for example, they couldn't hunt. They had their guns taken away. The Moravian schools were closed because teaching of English was forbidden. And if they contravened these rules and laws, they had to pay heavy taxes and fines. They also, excuse me, the delegates also expressed some anger because they said that Captain Stewart of the Mohawk had promised them that he would look after their interests and Britain would come to some kind of agreement. And in fact, what happened is he took their chief away into exile. So they were quite, they were quite happy they were quite angry that there was some kind of hidden anger underneath. They were quite critical of what the British had done. And let's see. They also asked for British protection as well, because their intention was to consult with the Chief Clarence and consult with the British government and then return to Bluefields. They asked for British protection. They said that, to quote Olivia, they said they had come away secretly and would have been killed if their purpose had been detected. They had come to ask the British government to maintain its protection over them, and they asked me whether personal protection would be given to them, the three delegates, on their return to Bluefields, as otherwise they would certainly be killed. And Olivier finishes the dispatch by saying, "I have no doubt that this is a well-informed expectation." The British refused to give them protection, and they the delegates sought exile in Kingston, and they were befriended by a Moravian pastor and who took them in, and they lived. I even have their address. I won't give you the full address in case somebody goes to the present occupier and starts asking them questions, but it was at Walter Street, Raytown, Kingston, Jamaica. Okay, I even have the number of the street, of the house on the street, but I'm not going to disclose that. And they lived there, and they set up the Moskitia Restoration Society. They were active in sending letters and petitions to the British governor, to the British government in London, and they often had meetings which were reported in the Kingston, the Daily Gleaner, the main newspaper of Kingston. Now, there was then, if I can just consult my notes, life in Kingston. Life in Kingston wasn't great for any of the Mosquito. You've got to remember that being a refugee is psychologically stressful. The Chief Clarence had a stipend and he seemed to be well looked after, but the delegates did not. They were poverty stricken and lived off charity and donations. I can just go on briefly to give a brief account of Chief Clarence's life in Jamaica, in Kingston. So he married a woman called Irene Morris in 1899. They had two children, Edna Clarence and Robert Harrington Henry Clarence. Edna was born in 1901 and died in 1963. Herbert Harrington Henry Clarence was born in 1906 and died in 1966. Now, their mother was not Indigenous, and therefore none of the children could inherit a hereditary title. Now, although the Colonial Office had provided Chief Clarence with an allowance, it was a fairly generous allowance. He actually appealed to the governor of Jamaica to increase the allowance because he found himself in debt. And in fact, his wife, Irene Clarence, wrote to the colonial secretary, the Sidney Oliver, and stated that actually Chief Clarence had left home and had stopped providing financial support for her and her daughter at the time. He'd left home in 1903. The chief had actually accumulated quite a few debts, and it was actually reported. I've read a report that the bailiffs arrived at their property because of mortgage arrears, and she was appealing for financial help. Now, when Governor Olivier contacted the chief, he explained. Now, this is quite a personal thing, that he'd left his marital home because his mother-in-law was cohabiting with him and he couldn't stand her. He couldn't get on with her at all. And so he also blamed his financial debts on rising costs after he'd been married and had a child. But it sounds also that he was swindled by some unscrupulous people who took advantage of him. So, concerned about his spending, Governor Olivier actually briefly placed him under police surveillance to find out what he was doing. Now, one police report, it was dated April the 4th, 1903. It noted that the chief had taken up residence at the Myrtle Bank Hotel in Kingston and described him as a quiet, harmless individual. But he was so heavily in debt that he was obliged some weeks ago to pawn some of his clothes. And just to quote further from that police report, they describe him as leading a moral life, but frequents taverns, where he spends a good deal of money, not on himself, as he's not a hard drinker. And it said in brackets, his favourite tipple was Gilbey's sherry at 1 shilling a pint. Right? But his money goes on a number of loafers with whom he associates and on whom he spends money for drinks. Okay, so I think Robert Henry Clarence was a bit too generous with down at the taverns. But he gradually fell out with the Mosquito delegates, and it was over money. It was over. I think it was a little bit unfair of the Mosquito delegates to say that the accusation was that because Robert Henry Clarence was receiving a stipend or a pension from the British government, he'd kind of given up on returning to the Moskitia, because the rumor was that as long as he lived in exile, he would receive this stipend, this pension. But when he returned to Bluefields, it would stop. And the delegates, who were receiving no money apart from charitable handouts, believed that this money had kind of been used to make him give up the Mosquito cause, and they accused him of such as well. They accused him of such. And it was these arguments were actually reported in the daily, or what was the newspaper called? I can't remember. I can't remember the
Daily Gleaner, maybe?
The Daily Gleaner. Yes, it was reported in the Daily Gleaner. So there was a big falling out between the two. And then so much so that the delegates reported this back to the headman in the Moskitia. And they said, the delegates, Sam Pitts, Lino Nelson, and George Cuthbert, recommended that the headman of the Mosquito of the Moskitia elect another chief, that they reject Chief Clarence and they elect another chief. And in March 1903, they got a reply back from the headman. And it said, basically, it said that, I mean, for example, Andrew Hendy was the official headman appointed by the Nicaraguans, but nobody accepted Andrew Hendy. Hendy himself said, I've seen diplomatic dispatches. Hendy himself said that he would be hereditary chief until the proper hereditary chief, Robert Henry Clarence, returned to Bluefields, and then he would hand over the title back to the real, proper, legitimate hereditary chief. But nobody respected Hendy. And after considering possible replacements for Robert Henry Clarence, the headman sent a declaration, and it said, and I quote from here, "It is not only our opinion, but that of the people, that the best candidate to this office is none other than the delegate, Mr. Samuel Pitts. Not only is he a Christian and a man of experience, but by his indomitable zeal and amid sorrow," when I say sorrow, it was because his wife died whilst he was in exile, amid sorrow, privation, and hardships, and also his unselfishness, having the only aim of Mosquito's welfare at his heart, he has won the approval of all of his people. And so Sam Pitts, through this declaration, would become, even though he wasn't of any royal lineage, he wasn't related to any of the royal family of the Moskitia. It was decided that he would become the hereditary chief. However, his appointment would have to wait until he got back to the Moskitia. Okay, so he wasn't actually appointed or elected hereditary chief until he returned to the Moskitia. Now, in 1904, it became clear that that Britain was negotiating a deal with Nicaragua to clarify and regularize the position of a situation on the Moskitia. Because it was governed by a treaty, Nicaragua couldn't simply take unilateral action. The Treaty of Managua was signed in 1860 by the Republic of Nicaragua and the government of the Kingdom of Great Britain. And therefore, the final settlement had to be agreed by both parties, by both governments. So negotiations took place, and they were concluded by the Harrison-Altamirano Treaty, which officially and legally ended the Treaty of Managua and handed over the Moskitia to the Republic of Nicaragua without any reservations, without any special privileges, and that the Mosquito Indians would become citizens of the Republic of Nicaragua. They would be liable to military service. They would be liable to pay tax. They would be just like any other citizen of the the Republic of Nicaragua. Chief Robert Henry Clarence would be allowed to return to Nicaragua and live as a private citizen, not as a chief. He would also be given an amount of money of £4,000. The money would be given by Nicaragua to the Foreign Office, and it would then be given to Chief Robert Henry Clarence. But Chief Robert Henry Clarence said on May 23rd, 1906, he said that he would not go back under those circumstances, and he expressed his anger that really the Mosquito cause had been sold out by Great Britain. And just to quote him, he said, it is absolutely impossible for me to live under Nicaraguan rule. And as I pointed out in a previous communication, I would distinctly be between two fires. I would, without the slightest provocation or justification, be assassinated by the Nicaraguans first, and my accusation and trial would come afterwards. And if this did not happen, my own people would accuse me of having sold them and my country. Indeed, it appears to me that the condition now imposed that I should return to the reservation in the position and on the terms stated seems designed and recommended to His Majesty's government with a sinister intention of ridding all parties of a troublesome matter in a manner speedy and effective, if primitive and violent. So Robert Henry Clarence made the decision that he would not return to the Moskitia. He would live for the rest of his life in Jamaica and Kingston. He would receive the £4,000, and the £4,000 would be invested by the Foreign Office, and he would get an annuity of something like £200 or £400 a year, and then he would have to find his own. He would have to get a job and live like a normal citizen, you know. The Mosquito delegates made one last attempt to persuade Britain to renounce the Harrison-Altamirano Treaty. So in 1906, they sent two delegations. In 1906, yes, they sent two delegations to London. Now, you've got to remember that I'm sat at the British National Archives in London, and there are thousands of documents. There are tens of thousands of documents. I'm sure somewhere there's more about sandpits somewhere, okay, but I'm only one person. I've only got so much time, and so the amount of information I've got from sandpits is quite small, but nonetheless interesting. So in 1907, they sent a delegation to sandpits, to London. That in the early part of 1907, sandpits travelled to London. I have no information of that at all, but I do know that he went because I've got a copy of the passenger list of one of the ships that sailed from Kingston to Bristol. and his name is on it. So I do know that he went there, right? So I know that he went in the early 1907. He then returned to Jamaica, and then the Daily Gleaner reported that in June that he was going to attempt another diplomatic mission. He was accompanied by somebody called William Bent, who was his translator. I believe that William Bent was the son of a Moravian pastor who'd spent time on the Mosquito Coast, and so William Bent spoke English and Mosquito. And their mission was a final attempt to persuade the Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, to abandon the Harrison-Altamirano Treaty. Excuse me. So that the reports in the Daily Gleaner were that Pitts had visited London earlier that year. He'd spoken to the Colonial Secretary of to Jamaica, Sidney Olivia, who was now resident in London. And it would be my next step is to find out if Sidney Olivia had a personal diary, because I would be able to find out more details of that first meeting. And I think it's held in the Bodleian Library at University of Oxford. I'm not sure, but I'm going to find out anyway. That there's no record of a meeting between Sam Pitts and Sir Edward Grey during the second delegation, that is in June 1907. There's no record of that meeting in the Foreign Office files. Now, Pitts was an unofficial visitor, and it's likely that the Foreign Office wouldn't allow an official meeting with Sir Edward Grey because he was an unofficial. But also at the time, Edward Grey's wife had died recently, and he kind of stepped back from official duties in 1906. So it's unlikely that the two actually met, and there's no record of a meeting between Sam Pitts and Sir Edward Grey. But I did find a note by a permanent undersecretary to the Foreign Office called Charles Harding that it provides evidence that Sam Pitts had arrived in London and had some kind of contact with the Foreign Office. So there's a note with his to say that two Mosquito delegates had been in London. Let's see if I can find the original note that says it. No, I can't. I'm sorry, but I can give you a summary of what it said. So there were two Mosquito delegates that had contact with Sir Charles Harding. And he says that they had come to London and they were stranded in a penniless state. And they were given financial support by some charitable people. Once again, I don't know who they were. I suspect it was Sidney Olivia. I suspect it was him who supported them. And another official at the Foreign Office, Sir Eric Barrington, persuaded the Treasury to pay their fare back to Jamaica. Right? To pay their fare back to Jamaica. Let's see if I can give you a bit more information on that. No, I can't. Sorry.
That's okay.
That's all right. So let's see. So Sam Pitts returned to Jamaica, and he had an interview with the Daily Gleaner, and he reported that he'd had a conversation with Sir Edward Grey, and they refused to renounce the Harrison-Altamirano Treaty. So in effect, the British had signed over the Moskitia to the Nicaraguans. Sam Pitts also stated in the interview that he intended to return to the Mosquito Coast and inform the Indian headman about Britain's decision. Now, the editorial, the article in the Daily Gleaner finishes with a pessimistic note. It says, "Just what might arise from this decision for Sam Pitts to return remains to be seen, but it is not expected that it will tend to improve the present relations between the Mosquito Indians and the Nicaraguan government." So Sam Pitts arrived in Bluefields and travelled north to Yulu, and Yulu was his hometown. But by that time, Pitts was not a popular man with many people. He and the delegates had fallen out with Chief Clarence. So Chief Clarence was not supporting him. Pitts had also fallen out with the powerful Moravian Church. Now, the Moravian Church was in the process of political negotiations to reopen Moravian schools. I think the agreement with the Zelaya government, the Nicaraguan government, is that they would teach Spanish. They would teach other subjects as well in English, but they would also teach Spanish language as well. So the students would learn to speak Spanish as well. So there was a kind of negotiation to reopen the Moravian schools. And the Moravian church itself is notoriously non-political. So Pitts had fallen out with Chief Clarence. He'd fallen out with the Moravian church, and he seemed to have he had few allies left. But he did gather a significant following from amongst the town of Yulu and the neighbouring villages of Tuapi, Karata, and Hallover. Now he died. He died soon afterwards. Now, one account says that he died in a Nicaraguan military action. He tried to raid the Nicaraguan military munitions in Yulu, and he was killed. However, the Moravian mission reports, which I've had a look at, suggest that, yeah, he did actually have quite a substantial following. His followers were armed with rifles and dynamite, and they caused a few incidents. This attracted the attention of the military garrison, the Nicaraguan military garrison based at Principalca. They received instructions to arrest Samuel Pitts. Nicaraguan troops, they headed for Yulu, but they didn't find him there. He was eventually trapped down at Tuapi, where there was a firefight, and during this firefight, Pitts was either killed or he was badly injured, and he was badly injured, managed to escape, but he died very soon afterwards. Now, there's only one reference to this in the Foreign Office files that I could see about the actual Sam Pitts rebellion, and I can just quote from this. In December 1907, an affray took place between some Mosquito Indians near the Wawa River and the Nicaraguan authorities. The former, the Mosquito Indians, say that they were attacked by soldiers without provocation on the occasion of the return from London of Sam Pitts, a delegate elected by them to submit a statement of their grievances to His Majesty's government. The latter, the Nicaraguans, contend that Pitts was trying to raise a revolution. Whatever may have been its origins, the gathering was very harshly repressed, and although no actual breach of the Mosquito Treaty, the Harrison-Altamirano Treaty, had occurred, I received instructions from the Foreign Office in February 1908 to express in semi-official notes the concern of His Majesty's government at the recent occurrences, and their hope that the local authorities would be ordered to treat the Indians with humanity and consideration. Although the note was worded in very conciliatory terms, it was not well received. So Pitts was dead, killed by an action in either Yulu or Tuapi. And less than 1 month later, Chief Clarence was also dead. He went into the public hospital in Kingston for an operation. It was a simple operation as well. He was accompanied by his wife, so that meant he had some kind of reconciliation with his wife. And in those days, they used to, before you had a surgical operation, they used to sedate people with chloroform, which wasn't the safest thing to use, but it was the only thing they had at the time. And he died under sedation. So he went into a public hospital, and he'd been an inpatient for some time. He'd had a couple of operations, and then he'd had an operation in January, I think. He was put under sedation with chloroform, and he died under that sedation. Now, there was a report of there was a coroner's report, which I've looked at, and there's a death certificate as well. Now, the death certificate did not use his title of chief, and it states that the death was caused by the administration of chloroform. Predisposing causes were fatty degeneration of the heart. And for his occupation, on the death certificate, his occupation says nil. Now, during the coroner's hearing, the doctor treating the chief said that he'd reacted so violently to the attempt to sedate him with chloroform because he was probably an alcoholic. Now, this was probably because of his life in exile and the psychological impact that it had. It's not unusual that that life as a refugee has that kind of psychological impact. The chief seems to have had some kind of reconciliation with his wife, because she testified at the hearing, the coroner's hearing, excuse me, that she visited him and she was with him at the day he died. And he left her to go into the surgery, and then about half an hour, 20 minutes later, the doctor came out and told her that the chief was dead. Now, and the last information I have about the chief is that he's buried in Maypen Cemetery in Kingston, in St Andrew's Parish Church. And the person who told me this was the vicar of the church. I managed to contact him by email, and he told me. So I hope that was of interest. I don't know how long. I've been going for quite a long time now, but I've tried to make it as detailed as possible and bring out the micro history, the history not of big events, of empires and kingdoms and royal and navies and battles, but the history of the little people. And it's the small individuals that make history tick. The people like Robert Henry Clarence, the people like Sam Pitts, and even, has to be said, the people like Rigoberto Gobedas, Commissioner Lacayo, people like Vice Consul Harrison. This is the real history that I'm really interested in, and looking at these diplomatic this diplomatic correspondence, it allows me to bring back the voices of these individuals from the past into the present to give us a flavour, not just an account, but a flavour of what it was like to live in Bluefields and experience the incorporation.
Well, I want to just read to you some of the comments that we've been getting. Things like, okay, now we're getting into it. I know it's here. It's all how we know record history. You're recording history on your program. You have proof of history, verbal history. Anyone can write something, but for Barraco to speak this 100%. Also, we have from Miss Dolene Miller in Bluefields. I understanding that we were betrayed to protect our territory. My question is, what similarities Barraco sees with the autonomy process during Robert Clarence and today's autonomy? Is it a continuation of demanding territorial rights?
Yes, this is a really good question because this is something I've changed my mind on. I have to admit that I have changed my mind on this. So the vast majority of academic literature, and remember, I'm an academic who lives in England. I'm not a politician. I'm not a Costeño. The vast majority of, and also it's important to remember that my academic background, my research began looking at the Sandinistas and looking at no further back than the 1970s. Okay? So, and what happened is I had to depend on other people's research. Now I'm doing my own research on the 19th century. But before I had to depend on other people. And those other people, although they wrote that history, they hadn't done what I'd done and look at the actual evidence, right? They'd not gone to the British National Archives and spent months and months and days painstakingly going through hundreds or thousands of documents. And what they said was that the Mosquito Council was just a fiction. It was run by American business interests and so on and so on. And so when it disappeared, it wasn't a big deal. You know, the Mosquito didn't really understand anything. And I can tell you now that there's lots of diplomatic correspondence that use the word savages, semi-savages, barbarians, right? Even, that there was no respect at all. There was no idea that the Mosquito, and not just the Mosquito, but other residents like Creoles and Garifunos and Ramas and Mayagnas and Suma Mayagnas had any concept of government. And that's one of the reasons why Britain was only too pleased to hand the Mosquito over to the Nicaraguans. They thought that they would civilize them. That's what they said, that they produce government. And government was something that was beyond the comprehension of indigenous people. Now, I have given you quotations from Robert Henry Clarence. Ariel, I can send these documents to you by email. You can see them yourself. Robert Henry Clarence was a well-educated, articulate, intelligent person. He had a concept of government, and so did the Mosquito Council. And I hope that my research puts an end to this idea that the Mosquito Council was a fiction. The people running the Mosquito Council had a concept of law. They had a concept of government. They even had a concept of international law and treaty law. Okay? So my initial ideas, taken from other people's research, that the Mosquito Council and the reservation was a fiction. This is wrong. This is wrong. And so the ideas I had, that in the 1970s, what happened is that Mosquito people, particularly associated with Al Promiso, with Al Promiso, people like Hazel Lau, people like Brooklyn Rivera, um, made contacts with Native American, the international indigenous movement, particularly in America, in the United States, but also in Australia and New Zealand, and began to bring back with them this notion of a civil rights movement based on indigenous rights. And it's that reignited this notion of autonomy. However, the initial idea was that it wasn't reignition, it was not the rediscovery of autonomy, it was an invention, it was a reinvention. Because originally autonomy wasn't real, because it was the Mosquito Council was dominated by Americans and so on, and the British, and it wasn't autonomous really. So what my research shows you was that the re-emergence of autonomy from the 1970s, and really with the Sandinista revolution in the 1980s, it was not a reinvention. It was not something new. It was it was a rebirth. It was the, the rediscovery of a real autonomy that really did exist. Okay, so that hopefully what I'm trying to do is show that the the contemporary autonomous movement is not some kind of invention taking place because of the cultural, social, political, economic processes happening in the 1980s, particularly globalization, right? Where a new wave of political ideas on autonomy, indigenous rights come in from the area from outside and spark new ideas. Okay, I think that is true. I think there's a lot to be said about that. Al Promiso played a role, and so did Miso Rosata play a role in this. However, what I hope my research shows is that there was a genuine autonomy throughout the 19th century. And there's other people, somebody called Danielle Mendiola, who's done research on earlier periods on the kingdom of Moskitia to show how independent that kingdom was. It was a real kingdom. So, and you also had a few days ago, or last week, you had Damien Clavel, talking about individual kings and the colonization of Poyas. It shows you that there was an active political consciousness, that there was something going on, that there were governing structures. And so whatever was happening in the 1970s, that process of autonomy has deep roots going back at least 100 years, more than 100 years. Does that answer the question?
Most definitely. And then she also wrote and said, history repeating. Difficulties of exile is what is happening also in this very moment in Nicaragua history. This was very cruel for Robert Clarence. And she ended by saying, I understand that Samuel Pitts had a cruel death. Please ask if this is true.
I don't know, and I really don't know. He has a current debt.
Cruel.
Oh, sorry, a cruel death. Sorry about that. It's the microphone. Uh, I do not know, and I haven't seen any accounts of the actual death of Sam Pitts. I know that from what I understand, he was shot to death in a firefight, and as I said in my talk, that he was either killed instantly in Twapi or he escaped and and died soon afterwards amongst his followers. I don't know whether I can't say any more than that. I just don't have the details.
Thank you very much. One last comment. My most important take home is that this is a living file of Luciano Barraco, freely speaking about his long lived work on the Moskitia and appreciation and respect for the history of autonomy of the Moskitia, long overdue for him to speak on his life work. Can Mr. Barraco again mention another researcher he mentioned?
Yeah. So there's quite a few of us now that are using these documents, and the documents are brilliant because they are actual evidence by people who were around at the time. And what the documents do, they they also have like personal comments about the characters of people. You know, what was Robert Henry Clarence like? You know, that kind of thing. What was Rigoberto Cabezas like? Rigoberto, for example, what I didn't mention is Rigoberto Cabezas was often seen as an adventurer. He was a Costa Rican who had been, yeah, he complained about the Moskitias not respecting Nicaragua and inviting foreigners in. He was not a Nicaraguan himself, right? And also the council, the municipal council that was elected after the full incorporation, after the Harrison Altamirano Treaty, this council was all American. There were no Nicaraguans on it. So, and they complained, the Nicaraguans complained that the Mosquito Council was full of Jamaicans. But the council that they elected were all North Americans. So, and Rigoberto Cabezas, by the way, he was a soldier of fortune. He thought he would make his name and become famous, but soon afterwards, he was told to leave the Bluefields, and I think he went to Masaya or Granada. He had consumption, tuberculosis, and he wasn't well respected, and he died in obscurity.
Wow.
Not long after. These, Ariel, are the little things of details of history that just make the difference, make it interesting for people. Okay, I'm quite interested in this. So the people who have conducted research similar to my own is Daniel Mendiola, who's conducted research on the Mosquito Kingdom. Absolutely brilliant, really, really first class. And he's looked at archives that are located in San Jose in Costa Rica, and archives in Spain as well.
Wow.
Okay, so there's Daniel Mendiola, and then there's Damien Clavel, who's written about some of the Mosquito kings at the beginning of the 19th century. Now there's also excuse me, there's also an academic from India,
Yes.
who's I can't remember her name. I'm just bringing it up now. Yes, do you know
Rajesh.
that's right. I've just brought
Rajeshwari.
That's right. I've just brought my that's right. I've just brought my email up to find her name, and she's just sent me an email, unopened. Okay, Rajeshwari Dutt. Okay, so she's looking at the 19th century as well, particularly the mid 19th century. She's also got a specialism on Belize as well,
Wow.
or what was called British Honduras. And if I can advise you, Ariel, I think she would be an interesting person to interview as well.
I would love to interview her as well, but I haven't had her email. So
right. Well, I'll tell you what, Ariel. I'll contact. As I say, she just sent me an email now. I'll write to her now and I'll ask her to contact you, and you'd like to invite her on. Okay.
Great. That would be great, man. Thank you so much. Luciano,
Yeah.
man, I can't say thanks enough, man. Thank you very, very much for
Could I,
this, man. The people are very,
Ariel?
very yes.
Could I just say that to your listeners, I'm very busy writing a book now. I'm halfway through it. It's called Between Empires and Republics, the Central America's Moskitia. Okay, so sometime later on this year or early next year, it should be published, and it's the best book I've ever written. It's the
Well,
most detailed book, the book I've anguished over, the book I've worked the hardest on, and it should be a really, really interesting read.
wow. I can't wait, man. I can't wait. Definitely can't wait. Well, once again, brother, thank you very, very much, man. You're making a very strong impact in our community, and people are loving your work as we are talking. So, and just know that this recording, a lot of people listen to it. Yeah, and they always think that it's very, very useful information. It's information that we definitely need right now.
Yeah, I also think your work is very important, and the fact that you're doing these kinds of broadcasts. I've been to Bluefields on a number of occasions, and Puerto Cabezas and Corn Islands as well, and I understand that the role that public radio plays in the communication of ideas along the coast.
Yeah.
Okay, but radio is far more. For example, in Britain, we have lots of social media and the television, but along the coast, I think that radio is a very important uh, means of communication, far more important than it is in the UK. And I think that these radio programs are really important for public education and an outlet. It's not just for my outlet of my ideas. It's an outlet for ideas and then open them up for discussion. So thank you very much, Ariel,
Thank you very much,
on
man.
behalf of myself and I'm sure for other academics in Europe and North America as well for providing a channel that is open not just for academics and people at university, but people living in towns and villages along the coast.
Thank you very much, man. And I also want to say thanks to all our Moskitian leaders, who stand up for themselves, and in a lot of cases the world turned their back on them. But now we are here to tell their story, and reivindicate them. So thank you very much, man. Thanks a lot. Have a great day. And, I pray that we could always be in conversations and
Yeah.
communication. All right.
Okay. Thanks very much, Ariel.
All
Have a
right.
nice day.
All right. You too, man. Thanks. Give thanks. Well, my people, we gone way overboard. We got way, way overboard today. But well, you know the situation and you know what it is. It's 1 o'clock with 7 minutes. That is a full 2 hours. Well, so we started at 11 o'clock talking to talking to Barraco here tonight. And well, this morning we're deep into the morning. So thanks for all who stay tuned. But this is just too much of a rich information. And so look out for the SoundCloud version. And they are going to be sharing it with people. Make sure you all share this information to people because it is vital that we learn and know our history, my people. And we have full intention to keep this going and reaching out to different people in academia for make them bring our story to we so that we could understand where we come from and what we is about. Just like how the brethren say that Chief Clarence is actually buried in the Maypen Cemetery in Jamaica, which is in Kingston, right there near the same Water Street that he mentioned. Also close to areas like Trenchtown, as a matter of fact, closest to area where the Trenchtown Culture Yard Museum is. different kind of things around that area. So for all the people them with us be going Jamaica and these cruise ship them, you could take a little bit of detour sometimes and go right into the Maypen Cemetery on a little journey for find Chief Clarence tomb. Is something maybe that we should look into. You know what I mean? Also, we could always look into a Chief Clarence Day. Where could that be? Most definitely May 23rd, 1906, when he refused to be a Nicaraguan. Well, my people, give thanks once again for tuning in. And we're going to keep forward ever, backwards never. Make sure you say you tune in this Saturday and Rasta Reggae Talk. And well, next week, Thursday, of course, we're going to be back right here again. I think this interview is just, I can't cut it. I just have to publish it the way how it is recorded because people need to hear the whole story. And we give thanks for this brethren Luciano Barraco, you know what I mean? Because you could say they care what him take. You understand me, my people? They care what him take for bring this information down to like a level where anybody will listening to this could understand. So much things we learn, so much things we read. You understand me? So much things we learn and so much things we read. But this kind of, the way how him do it is like, say, him filling in the gap them in between our history. Because when you read things and you say things and this and that, your memory have a way of, formulating everything then. But when this brother here talk, step by step, specifically talking about, this is not his opinion or his ideas. This is actual document that our leaders, our real leaders, you understand me? Them put themselves into history because nobody never want to do it. And when you think I just be telling you say that Nicaragua lie about history. They lie to our people about our history. And they even using our own people as agents to lie about the Nicaraguan history. To our people, they teach all them school them where they teaching the pure lie. Why you think that is important, my people? Why would you think it's important to lie to a people? For keep them confused. And these is the kind of things them that we have to think about as our children are being educated. Serious thing, my people. Well, make we leave it to that because it's late. So, give thanks, my people. Give thanks. I want to leave you with this one. Have a most blessed night. Rest well, my people. Rest well. And make we get up tomorrow and do it all over again. Give thanks.